Eskom's implementing of a load limit project. Now, what exactly is this? Well, I understand the power utility has selected customers to partner with it, that's an interesting choice of words, in a pilot program to ensure that rolling blackouts are reduced. So how exactly does load limiting work? Not load shedding, not blackouts, load limiting. And what exactly is the impact on the grid? Well, luckily I have an expert. Always a pleasure to have Hilton Trollip with me this afternoon. Hello, Hilton. I appreciate the time from down in Cape Town for us this afternoon. So what exactly is load limiting? Help orientate me. How's this different to load shedding and blackouts? Afternoon.
Good afternoon, Gareth, and hello everybody else. So probably the easiest way to describe load limiting would be to compare it with the rush hour on our roads. So as you know, if you go in the middle of the night, if you go down our highway and the roads, they're empty. But if you try and go down them at 5:30 in the evening, the highways are full, there's traffic jams, etc., etc. Now, electricity systems work the same way. During the middle of the night, we need a lot less power than when everybody gets home and has a shower, which makes their geyser switch on, decides to cook, and if, when it's winter, decides to heat up their home. And so the engineers have to design the system to provide, the same as the roads, this rush. And so I think another word for load limiting would be load shifting. So that means that instead of cooking between 6 and 7 or 7 and 8 or whatever, because there's a shortage of electricity at that time, you cook earlier or later. And this is standard practice in many countries, except in those countries they usually achieve it, and I thought this was the best way to describe it, by they charge more, they charge much more over the peak. So people can use power at 6 in the evening, but it costs them a lot more. So South Africa isn't in a stage yet where we've implemented what's called time of use billing or tariffs, and we've got this load shortage. And so this way of doing it is we're asking people if, instead of having an economic incentive, whether for their own good, they'll shift their load, not use their geyser or their stove. You can still use a small kettle, or at this 10 amps, you can use a microwave, you can use a small kettle, a toaster, but you can't use your microwave, the kettle, and the toaster all at the same time. Yeah. Also, you'd have to switch your geyser off, but just until later, or you have it on earlier.
Well, I understand completely, and obviously I'm not going to even begin to weigh into how the technicalities of this work, Hilton. This is why you're the expert. But aren't we essentially just moving the problem earlier or later in the day? If everyone is now being asked nicely not to use their appliances during peak time, aren't we just creating a peak time at another part of the day, another time in the day?
So this is why, and it is a bit complicated to explain, so this is why I've used the roads as an example.
Yeah.
So if we got government departments, which they also do in other countries, or big companies, to, instead of all starting at 9 o'clock in the morning, some start at 8, some start at 7, we get over the traffic jam. Because instead of the roads being empty at a certain part, or not jammed at a certain part of the day, we shift the load to there. And the electricity system's exactly the same thing. There's the so-called peak that we have, where, as I say, everybody gets home and switches on the kettle. And that's when we have the problem. So if people can be persuaded, using various ways, to shift when they have their geysers on, it's not shifting the problem, it's actually getting rid of the problem of the traffic jam. It's a bit complicated, but that's how it works.
Sure. Yeah, no, I take it. I just get a sense. I wasn't too sure if it was, we're just now basically moving it to earlier in the day or later in the day, but I take your point about the rush hour. Help me understand as well, because I'm so glad I talked to experts like you, because now we've got blackouts, we've got load shedding, now we've got load limiting, load shifting. I feel like I need a degree in how Eskom comes up with these titles. Is this the same situation, Hilton, that I'm seeing in Fourways in Johannesburg, where there's now, if you own a smart meter, Eskom is going to limit you through your smart meter. Is this the same thing that you and I are talking about, or is this another Eskom trick that's up their sleeves to limit how much power is coming into your house?
This is exactly the one. They're going to limit it because we are not in a stage of kind of public cooperation, because people are not that happy with what's going on, where we could ask people. When we had the big load shedding in 2006 in Cape Town, we just had load shedding at that stage in Cape Town. There was a program where there's a public awareness campaign, and people were asked to do this. And in those days, people weren't as unhappy as they are these days. And they actually did it, and it was a great success. We managed to shift the load. This is, let me use another example. When I grew up back in the olden days, as my daughter would say, in the 1960s, in Vereniging, what happened in those days is that the municipality had a little switch on everybody's geyser. It's called a ripple controller. Yeah. And what they would do, similar to what Eskom are saying they'll do now, they just used to switch off everybody's geyser for half an hour, and they'd roll that through everybody's, each group at a time's geysers. And as a result, you didn't really notice it, because you don't need to heat your geyser up in half an hour at any stage. And they they got rid of the peak. They moved the peak into a valley, and they got a flatter demand curve, as it's called, which was more matched to the amount of supply that's available. And so the electricity minister, when he was first appointed, he said, it's all about matching supply and demand. And one of the ways to do it is you shift the peak into the valley, and you end up with a lower plateau. And that is because we have a supply constraint, we can meet that lower supply with our, and it's only when the peak comes along, sometimes, that we need load shedding. So that's also why we have.
I never actually thought about it with that analogy. I think it's such a clever way of explaining the peak, because we hear about the energy peak. I never thought about the valley at the bottom, and what you're trying to do is balance the tree. You're trying to get the peak lower, the valley a bit higher, so we've got a bit more balance. You see, this is why I talk to you, Hilton Trollip. It's good to have you back.
And I wanted to add another thing.
Go for it, very briefly, please.
So Eskom meters and a lot of the municipality meters that are in our houses at the moment, they've actually got a lot more functionality to do this kind of thing. So going forward, we could, for example, but we need to educate the customers, we could have time of use. So we could say to people, look, you can use your full supply at 6 o'clock, between 6 and 8, but you're going to be charged triple per unit. But if you use it in the middle of the night, we'll only charge you half per unit.
Yeah.
And this is another way you get people to shift the peak into the valleys.
Yeah, you can almost,
we can see that coming down the line.
You can almost equate it to cell phone contracts, cell phone companies. You've got peak time data tariffs and off-peak data tariffs, midnight data tariffs. I get the concept. It's a clever idea. Maybe we'll head there one day. It would make more sense. But Hilton, I'm going to say thank you very much for taking time on a Saturday to join me this afternoon. Energy expert Hilton Trollip, making real sense, I think, for actually how this load limiting is actually going to be taking place. Yes, try and stay with me. Load shedding, blackouts, load limiting now is also coming into play, but it looks like it's trying to get those peaks and those valleys, the balance of the power, so we don't see these spikes in power. That's my takeaway, but I'm only a journalist, so luckily we have experts like Hilton.